a ship whose only job was to warn other ships sent out its warning, and then went down itself. August 1918, off the North Carolina coast, a submarine's guns finished a vessel that couldn't run, anchored on purpose above a bank of sand called Diamond Shoals. This is Cape Hatteras, the graveyard of the Atlantic, where somewhere between 1,000 and 5,000 wrecks rot in the shallows. The easy answer is the sandbars, but the sandbars are only what you can see. Why does this one bend of low sand keep killing crews good enough to survive anywhere else? Hold on to that question, because it is going to get worse before it gets clearer. And everything you are about to see is documented, not legend, not folklore. Wreck reports, court testimony, Coast Guard logs, naval records, a lighthouse that had to run from the sea, and a wreck that became the first protected shipwreck in American history. 5,000 ships is the high estimate, and historians argue about it, because nobody can count what the sand swallowed before anyone was writing losses down. Record-keeping in these waters starts around 1526. The point is not the exact number. The point is that the number keeps growing across sail and steam and steel and diesel, across the age of the compass and the age of the satellite, as if the technology never mattered at all. Start with the name, because it is not marketing. Graveyard of the Atlantic is what sailors themselves called this coast, and they earned the phrase the hard way over 4 centuries. Merchant schooners, warships, tankers, fishing boats, passenger steamers, a submarine, a movie replica tall ship. What should stop you is not that ships sank here, because ships sink everywhere, but that they sank here in every era and in every form, from the first European hulls feeling their way along the shore in the 1500s to vessels lost within living memory. When something kills sailing ships and steamers and steel warships and diesel-powered replicas alike, the flaw is not in any one of them. It is in the place. So start with the thing you can point to on a map. Cape Hatteras is the sharp elbow of the Outer Banks, a thin, bent chain of barrier islands that stands off the North Carolina mainland like a drawn bow. In places, the islands sit as much as 30 miles out to sea, cut off from the mainland by the wide, shallow water of Pamlico Sound. These are not rock, they are sand. Ribbons of dune and beach a few feet above the ocean, built by the water and constantly rearranged by it, migrating landward year after year as storms push them back. There is no bedrock spine holding them in place. The land you are standing on at Cape Hatteras is the same material as the bars that kill ships. It is all one restless pile of sand, and the ocean owns every grain of it, and nothing about that sand is permanent, which is part of the trap. The barrier islands do not merely erode. They migrate, rolling landward over centuries as the ocean strips sand from their seaward face and storms fling it across to the sound side, so that the whole island slowly walks toward the mainland. Storms cut new inlets straight through them and close old ones. In a single hurricane in 1846, the sea sliced 2 brand new inlets clean through these banks, Hatteras Inlet and Oregon Inlet, openings that had not existed the week before and that redrew navigation on the entire coast overnight. Think about what that does to anyone trying to chart this place. It is not only the underwater shoals that move. The islands themselves move. The inlets open and close. And the very outline of the coast on the map is a snapshot of something that will not hold still. You are navigating a coastline that is, in a real and physical sense, temporary. Now look at where that elbow points. It juts east and south straight out toward the deep Atlantic, toward the shipping lane that every vessel running between the northeastern ports and the Caribbean or the Gulf has to negotiate. For centuries, that lane was the highway of American trade. If you were carrying cargo up or down the East Coast under sail, you did not have the luxury of standing far out to sea and giving the Cape a wide berth. You wanted the current, or you wanted to dodge the current. And either way, the geometry of the coast squeezed you toward the one place you least wanted to be. The Cape reaches out to meet the traffic. That is the first cruel fact of this place. It is not a hazard you can easily root around. It sits in the doorway. And the currents make that squeeze tighter than the shape of the coast alone ever could. Think about a ship trying to get south, down the coast. In the age of sail and early steam, out to sea runs the Gulf Stream. A wall of warm water shoving north at up to 3 or 4 knots. And trying to push south through it is like walking the wrong way on a moving sidewalk, burning days and coal and canvas for every hard-won mile. So southbound captains did the sensible thing. They stayed inshore, in the narrow band of water between the beach and the western edge of the stream, to keep out of that adverse current. And the inshore edge of that band, off Cape Hatteras, is Diamond Shoals. Northbound ships, meanwhile, wanted the stream's free push and rode it up the coast, which swept them in toward the same cape from the other side. Both directions of traffic, for exactly opposite reasons, were herded toward the identical patch of water. The Gulf Stream did not only build the shoals, it steered the ships onto them. And directly off the tip of that elbow lies Diamond Shoals, a field of shifting sandbars running southeast from the point, out under the open sea. How far out? Depends on who you ask and when. Some accounts say 8 miles, some say 10, some say 14. That spread is not sloppy reporting. It is the truth of the thing. The shoals move. They are not a fixed reef you can chart once and trust forever. They are 3 main banks broken by narrow channels, called diamond shoals because from above, the pattern once looked like a diamond, and they breathe in and out with the seasons and the storms. A channel that was open and deep one year can be closed and shallow the next. A captain working from a chart that was accurate when it was printed can drive his ship onto a bar that did not exist when the survey was done. Stand on the beach at the Cape, and you can watch the leading edge of the whole thing. There is a place called Cape Point, where the shoreline bends sharply back on itself and the waves march in from 2 directions at once and collide right at the tip, throwing up a ragged line of white where they meet and cancel and rebound. That collision of waves at the point is only the visible surface of something happening underwater for miles out to sea. The shoals are that same meeting extended below the waterline. They'll told me mais, a be water-wise, built of the sand the meeting keeps dropping. What you can see breaking at your feet on the beach is the small, safe version of what is waiting out where the ships have to pass. That is the beginning of the answer to the question the hook left hanging. Why do ships end up on marked bars? Because the marks cannot keep up with the sand. The hazard is not static, and neither the charts nor the lights nor the buoys can perfectly track something that rebuilds itself every winter. But that is still only the surface of it. Because the real question is not what the shoals do. It is what makes the shoals in the first place and what makes them so violent. And for that you have to stop looking at the sand and start looking at the water moving over it. Here is where Cape Hatteras stops being an ordinary dangerous headland and becomes something stranger. 2 enormous ocean currents meet right here, and they could hardly be more opposite. Coming up from the tropics, warm and fast and deep blue, is the Gulf Stream, one of the most powerful currents on the planet. A river in the ocean carrying warm water north along the American coast. And nowhere on the entire United States East Coast does the Gulf Stream swing closer to the shore than off Cape Hatteras, because the continental shelf narrows here and the deep water crowds in. Running the other way, down from the north, cold and slower, is a southbound coastal current, a branch of the Labrador Current out of Canada that oceanographers call the Virginia Drift. Warm going north, cold going south, and they collide head-on, right off the point. There is a deeper piece of oceanography here that scientists still study intensely, because Cape Hatteras is not only where the two currents meet, it is where the Gulf Stream itself lets go of the American coast. All the way up from Florida, the warm current hugs the edge of the continental shelf, and right about at this latitude, off the Cape, it peels away from the land and swings out into the open Atlantic. Hatteras is the hinge of that turn, a genuine boundary in the ocean where warm tropical water, cold northern water, the shallow shelf, and the deep sea all meet in one place. Researchers run entire programs on this single stretch of water because so much is happening in it at once. For a ship, all of that abstraction comes down to one blunt fact. You are crossing a seam in the ocean, and seams are where things tear. Think about what that means physically, because this is the engine of the whole place. When those two water masses slam into each other, they lose their momentum, and moving water that loses its momentum drops whatever it was carrying. Both currents are carrying sand and shell and sediment. At the collision line, all of that load falls to the bottom. That is what builds Diamond Shoals. That is what maintains it. The shoals are not a leftover from some ancient geology. They are being manufactured, right now, today, by two currents grinding against each other and dumping their cargo of sand at the point of impact. Stop the currents, and the shoals would eventually wash away. The currents will not stop. So the trap rebuilds itself continuously, which is exactly why it will never stay on a chart. Put numbers on that collision, because the numbers are what a crew actually feels. The Gulf Stream can run at 3 or 4 knots. That does not sound like much until you realize it is a current moving faster than many older vessels could make headway against. A river in the sea as wide as a state and deep as a canyon. And where it grinds against water flowing the other way, the surface does not merely ripple, it heaps. Wind blowing against a strong current does not smooth the sea. It fights it. And the waves that fight rise up short and steep and jammed close together, so that instead of one long swell every 10 or 12 seconds, you get a wall every few seconds, with no rhythm to it at all. To the people aboard, that is the difference between a ship that rolls and recovers and a ship that is simply being beaten, struck again before it has come back up from the last blow, water coming aboard faster than it can drain. The ocean here is not just rougher. It is rough in a way that is specifically mechanically hostile to the way ships are built to stay alive. And the collision does not only build the bars. It does something to the sea surface, and it does something to the air. And both of those things are about to matter more than the sand. Take the sea surface first. When two currents flowing in opposite directions meet, the water does not simply cancel out and go calm. It piles up, shears, and turns confused. Waves that were rolling along in an orderly line off the Gulf Stream run straight into water pushing the other way, and the collision stacks them. Instead of long, spaced swells that a ship can climb and ride, you get short, steep, jumbled seas coming from several directions at once. A hull is designed to meet waves that arrive with some rhythm, to rise to one and settle before the next. Off Hatteras, the next wave arrives before the ship has recovered from the last, and it may arrive from a different angle than the one before it. The vessel never finds its footing. It gets knocked and knocked again and shoved sideways, and the helmsman is fighting water that refuses to behave. Now add the shoals underneath. A wave rolling through deep water carries its energy far below the surface. When that wave moves onto a shallow bank, the bottom squeezes it. The wave cannot spread its energy downward anymore, so it stands up. It gets shorter front to back and taller top to bottom, steeper and more vertical, until it trips over itself and breaks. This is why the sea over a sandbar is so much more violent than the sea a mile away in deep water. The same swell that was a gentle rise offshore becomes a breaking wall of water the instant it feels the shoal. So a ship that strays over diamond shoals does not just risk touching bottom. It sails into a zone where the waves themselves suddenly turn into hammers, exactly where the water is too shallow to give, and the hull is most likely to strike. Shallow water does not mean safe water here. Shallow water is where the sea hits hardest. And then there is the air. Warm current, cold current, sitting side by side. When warm, moist air over the Gulf Stream drifts across the cold water of the Virginia Drift, the moisture condenses and fog forms. Not gradually, not politely. Sea fog off Hatteras can close in fast and thick, and it forms precisely along the boundary where the two currents meet, which is precisely where the shoals are, which is precisely where a captain most needs to see. Before radar, fog did not just reduce visibility, it erased the world. It took away the coastline, the horizon, the light, every reference a navigator had, at the exact moment he was threading past the one obstacle that could gut his ship. You could be a mile from a wave-swept bank, in water turning steep and strange under your keel, and not be able to see the bow of your own vessel. Before radar, a captain caught in that fog had exactly one honest option, which was to stop being sure of anything. He could not see the light. He could not see the shore, the horizon, or the color of the water that would have told him he was drifting over a bank. He was reduced to a compass, a lead line dropped over the side to feel for the bottom, a watch counting off the seconds, and a rising dread, creeping through water he knew was full of shifting sand, listening. And the thing he was listening for was the worst sound there is in that situation, the low roar of surf breaking somewhere ahead in the murk. Because breaking surf in open water means a shoal, and by the time he could hear it, he was already close enough to be in serious trouble. Fog here did not simply blind a ship. It stripped a navigator of every sense but hearing, and then filled the silence with the one sound he most feared. And there is a particular horror in what happens when a ship finally does touch the shoals. Because a grounding here is not a gentle stop. A vessel driven onto a bar in heavy weather stops moving forward, but the sea does not stop for an instant. Wave after wave keeps rolling in and striking a hull that can no longer rise and ride over them, pinning it, slewing it broadside, pounding it down against the sand. The ship becomes a fixed thing in a moving ocean, which is the one thing a ship must never be. The waves a moving vessel would have climbed now break straight over her. And because she is aground in shallow water, her boats cannot be launched into that breaking surf without being smashed. And the crew cannot swim through it, and the shore, sometimes only a few hundred yards off, might as well be on the far side of the world. That is how so many of the dead in this story died within sight of land, not far out in the deep water. Right there, close in, up on the bar, where the sea is shallow enough to wade and violent enough to kill, staring at a beach they could not reach. Stack it all up, and you have the machine. The cape reaches out and pulls traffic close. The currents build shifting bars that no chart can hold. The shoals turn ordinary swell into breaking walls. The colliding water stacks confused seas that never let a hull settle, and the meeting of warm and cold hides the whole thing behind sudden fog. Geography sets the trap, the currents load it, the shoals arm it, and the fog covers it. None of these things is the danger by itself. The danger is that they all live in the same few square miles of water, and they all switch on together. So how did anyone survive here at all? In the centuries before engines and radar and radio? That is not a rhetorical question. People lived on these islands, fished these waters, and worked this coast for generations. And the ones who lasted did it by treating the ocean as something to be read, not conquered. The Outer Banks watermen learned to see the machine working. They read the color of the water because the pale green-brown churn over a shoal looks nothing like the deep blue of the Gulf Stream. They read the swell because a wave breaking where no wave should be breaking is a bank announcing itself. They read the sky and the wind and the temperature of the air on their faces, because they knew that a warm, wet breeze sliding over cold water meant fog was coming before they could see a wisp of it. This was not superstition, and it was not decoration. It was an observation system, refined by people who paid for every mistake, and its first rule was the hardest one for outsiders to accept. Sometimes you do not go. Sometimes the whole skill is knowing that today is a day to stay on the beach and let the cargo wait. Understand how isolated these people were, because it explains why their knowledge was so good and why the wider world ignored it for so long. For most of their history, the Outer Banks had no bridges and no easy road to the mainland. To live on Hatteras or Ocracoke was to live on a sandbar in the ocean, reachable mainly by boat across the sounds, cut off for days when the weather turned. The islanders fished, they piloted, they salvaged what the sea threw up, and they learned the water the way a farmer learns a field, because there was nothing between them and it. When a ship came apart in the surf, they were the only help for miles, and they had been dealing with wrecks and drowned strangers on their beaches for generations before any government thought to organize it. That is the knowledge we are talking about, not a quaint tradition, a hard, tested local science of survival, held by a few hundred people on a strip of sand. And it was almost always more accurate about that water than the confident men passing by in bigger ships with better charts. That instinct, the willingness to not sail, is exactly what the outside world kept overriding, because ships passing Hatteras were not on the islanders' schedule. They were on the schedule of owners and cargoes and contracts, and those schedules did not care that a local surfman could feel a change in the air. The men who died here again and again were, overwhelmingly, people running to someone else's clock past a coast whose own residents knew when to sit still. And do not think it took ironclads and submarines to teach this. The clock and the coast were killing people here long before any of the famous wrecks. Go back to October of 1837. A new steamboat called the Home, a fast, elegant sidewheel steamer, was running from New York to Charleston, with something like 135 people aboard. And she was built for speed and smooth coastal water, not for what waits off the Carolina banks. A hurricane that history remembers as Racer's Storm caught her, and as she came down past the Outer Banks, the sea began to tear her apart. She was driven ashore near Ocracoke, just down the banks from Hatteras, and there, almost within reach of land, she broke up in the surf on the night of the 9th. Of the roughly 135 people aboard, about 90 died. And here is the detail that should stop you cold. On that entire crowded steamer, there were 3 lifeboats, one of which was smashed at once, and a grand total of 2 life preservers. 2. The 2 men who managed to seize them lived. Almost everyone else was left to the surf. The loss of the Home was so public and so appalling that Congress actually responded, and the following year it passed one of the first federal ship safety laws in American history, requiring seagoing steamers to carry a life preserver for every soul aboard. Sit with how low that bar is. A life jacket per passenger. It took 90 people dying off Ocracoke to turn that obvious idea into law. And that is the pattern you are going to watch repeat for the next century and a half. The coast kills, the public recoils, the rules improve a little, and the ships keep coming, because each new rule answers the last disaster while the water is already building the next one. A life preserver keeps a body afloat. It does nothing about the shoals, the currents, the fog, or the reasons a captain was out in a hurricane in the first place. The government's answer to all of this was to try to out-engineer the machine. And the most visible piece of that answer still stands on the Cape, painted in a black and white spiral you can see for miles. The Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. There had been an earlier one. A shorter sandstone tower first lit in 1803, but it stood too low, and its light was too weak, so often swallowed by haze, and so bitterly complained about by the mariners who depended on it that it was a warning barely worth the name, a light you could miss until you were already in trouble. The one that stands there now was completed in 1870, and it is the tallest brick lighthouse in the United States, just under 200 feet from base to tip. 198.5 feet of hand-laid brick built to throw a warning light far enough out to sea that a ship could see it before the ship found the shoals. It was a genuine achievement, and it saved lives. It also revealed the deeper problem because of what happened to the ground it stood on. When that lighthouse was finished in 1870, it stood a safe 1,500 feet back from the ocean. A comfortable margin, nearly a third of a mile of solid beach between the tower and the surf. By 1930, 60 years later, the ocean was only about 150 feet away. The sea had eaten more than 1,300 feet of that margin. The land itself, the migrating sand we started with, was retreating out from under the very structure built to guard the coast, because the barrier island was doing what barrier islands do, rolling backward under the endless push of the waves. The lighthouse had not moved. The shoreline had come to get it. For decades they fought it, with groins and sandbags and artificial dunes. And for decades the ocean kept coming. And finally, in 1999, the state gave up trying to hold the beach and did something almost unbelievable instead. They moved the lighthouse. The whole thing. 4,400 tons of brick jacked up off its foundation, set on a track, and rolled 2,900 feet inland to safer ground by International Chimney Corporation out of Buffalo, and a team of house movers from Maryland who specialized in the impossible. The method was as brute as it was delicate. They cut the tower loose from its old foundation, jacked the entire 4,500-ton column up onto a grid of steel beams and roller dollies, and then pushed it along a purpose-built track with hydraulic rams, a few feet at a time, stopping constantly to be sure the old brickwork was not tearing itself apart under its own weight. It took months of preparation and then 23 days of that creeping inch-by-inch crawl in the summer of 1999 to walk the tallest brick lighthouse in the country, away from the sea that was about to take it. Sit with that image, because it tells you everything about who really controls this place. The single most solid, permanent, engineered structure on the entire Cape, the very symbol of human authority over the coast, could not hold its ground against the ocean. It had to retreat, 2,900 feet inland, and if a fixed light nearly 200 feet tall and built of brick could not stay put against Cape Hatteras, then what hope was there for the thing they tried next, the thing that had to guard the worst spot of all, the shoals themselves, out where you could not build anything on solid ground because there was no solid ground? What do you do when the only place worth guarding is a patch of open sea that eats everything you put on it? Before we answer that, go back to the last night of 1862, because there is a wreck out here that proves the sea off Cape Hatteras does not even need the shoals to kill you. It can do the job in open water, with nothing under the keel but depth, to a ship that was, at that moment, the most feared piece of naval technology on Earth. The USS Monitor. If you know one Civil War ship, it is probably this one, the Ironclad, the low, flat iron raft with a single revolving gun turret sitting on top like a cheese box on a shingle. The ship that had fought the Confederate ironclad Virginia to a standstill at Hampton Roads in March of 1862 and, in a single afternoon, made every wooden warship in every navy in the world obsolete. The Monitor was the future. Armored, turreted, steam-powered, unlike anything that had floated before. And that revolution had a price built into its very shape, a price nobody thought much about while it was winning battles in sheltered water. It is worth being exact about why the Monitor mattered so much because it is the key to the irony. She was the creation of the engineer John Ericsson, and her revolutionary idea was the rotating armored turret, a drum of iron carrying two heavy guns that could turn to aim in any direction independent of where the ship itself was pointed. Before her, a warship aimed its guns by aiming the whole ship. After her, the turret was the future, and every major warship for the next century would carry some descendant of the idea. She was, in the most literal sense, the most advanced fighting ship in the world, and every ounce of that advantage was packed into a hull deliberately built to sit down low in the water, where enemy shot could barely reach it, which is precisely the thing that would drown her. The Monitor rode almost flush with the sea. Her deck was barely above the waterline. That was deliberate, part of the design that made her so hard to hit, presenting almost nothing for enemy guns to strike. In the calm of a river or a protected roadstead, that was genius. In the open ocean, it meant the sea washed straight across her deck with nothing to stop it, and every joint and hatch and opening in that deck was a place the water wanted to get in. She was a warship built for battle in coastal shallows, and at the end of December 1862, the Navy needed her somewhere else. She was ordered south toward Beaufort, North Carolina, and on toward the blockade off Charleston. To get there, she had to go around Cape Hatteras, and because she was never meant to steam long distances through open sea, she did not go under her own power for the whole trip. She went on the end of a tow line, pulled by a wooden sidewheel steamer, the USS Rhode Island. And this was not a theoretical worry. The Monitor had already nearly drowned once, on her very first ocean voyage, earlier that same year, when she was towed from New York down to Virginia to fight the Virginia in the first place. In rough water on that delivery trip, the sea had come in around the turret and down the vents. The ship had wallowed dangerously, and her crew had spent frightening hours bailing and pumping just to keep her up long enough to reach Hampton Roads. She had shown them in the spring exactly how she behaved in a seaway. They had the lesson. They had watched this ship come within a hair of foundering in open water once already, and at the end of December they put her back out into the open Atlantic in winter to round the worst cape on the coast, because the need to move her outweighed the memory of how close the first passage had come. That is not stupidity. That is how the pressure works. The thing that almost killed you last time did not kill you. So you do it again because there is a war and a schedule, and the ship has somewhere to be. On the 29th of December, they set out, and for a while it was fine. That is how it always starts here. The first day looked reasonable. The men had no particular reason to think this passage would be different from any other. But as they came down toward the Cape on the 30th, the weather began to build, the way it builds off Hatteras when the wind turns and the currents start to argue with it, and the sea got up into exactly the kind of short, steep, confused chop this coast specializes in. And a ship that rides an inch above the water has no answer for that. The waves stopped washing over the Monitor and started burying her. Water came down the smokestack and the blower pipes. It found the gap under the turret, where the turret met the deck. It came in faster than anyone had planned for, because the ship had never been in seas like this, and nobody truly knew how she would behave until she was in them. They knew what the design was. That was the interpretation problem. The officers understood perfectly well that the Monitor was low and wet and not an open ocean ship. That was not a secret. But understanding a weakness on paper is different from watching it drown you, and the pressure to move the ship south was real. There was a war on. The blockade needed ironclads. You do not leave a war-winning weapon sitting idle in Virginia because the passage past a cape looks unpleasant. So they went, in winter, around the worst corner on the coast, at the end of a rope. And once the sea got up around the cape, the option to simply turn around and run back to shelter closed behind them, because turning a low, half-swamped, ironclad broadside to those seas to reverse course was its own way to die. So they did what crews do. They fought it. The engineers ran the pumps, throwing water back over the side as fast as the machinery could move it. When the main pumps could not keep up, they rigged more. Men bailed by hand. They tried to keep the fires lit under the boilers because the pumps ran on steam, and if the water reached the fires and put them out, the pumps would stop. And if the pumps stopped, it was over. That is the whole grim arithmetic of a foundering ship laid bare. Water coming in on one side of the ledger, pumps throwing it out on the other, and a crew doing everything human hands can do to keep the second number bigger than the first. For hours, they kept it close. And then the water rose to the fires anyway. As the sea kept flooding in, it reached toward the boiler room. And once the fires began to drown, the steam pressure fell, and the pumps slowed at the exact moment they were needed most. Now the arithmetic ran the other way, and everyone aboard could feel it in the way the ship sat lower and answered the sea more sluggishly. The Monitor was going to sink, and the only question left was how many of the 62 men aboard would get off her before she did. This is the point of no return, and you can date it almost to the hour. Late on the night of December 30th, into the small hours of December 31st, Commander John Bankhead signaled the Rhode Island that he had to abandon ship. The tow line was cast off, and the wooden steamer worked her way back toward the sinking ironclad in the dark and the gale to launch her boats. Now think about what that rescue actually involved, because this was not a case of pulling up to a dock. The Rhode Island had to put small open boats over the side into the same breaking sea that was killing the Monitor, and row them across to a ship so low in the water she was nearly awash, in the dark, in a winter gale off Cape Hatteras. Men had to climb out of the flooding turret and off the wave-swept deck and drop into pitching boats that were themselves in danger of swamping. Some made it. Some were washed off the deck before they could reach a boat. Some, by the survivors' accounts, could not bring themselves to leave the relative shelter inside the ship and went down with her, and understand what the men in the rescue boats were actually doing, because it is easy to say 46 were saved and skip past the cost of it. The Rhode Island could not come alongside. In that sea, the two ships would have battered each other to pieces. So her crew rowed open boats back and forth across a stretch of breaking, freezing water in the dark, over and over, each trip loading a few soaked and half-frozen ironclad sailors and pulling for the steamer, then turning around and going straight back for more while the Monitor settled lower beneath them. One of those boats came very near to being the death of everyone in it. The rescue was not a single act. It was a series of small, desperate crossings, any one of which could have ended with a swamped boat and every man in it gone. And the sailors of the Rhode Island made those crossings knowing exactly that. For strangers, in the middle of a winter night, because the sea demanded it and there was no one else. Survivors described the Monitor showing a red lantern as her distress signal, a small red light rising and falling in the blackness astern of the Rhode Island while the rescue boats struggled back and forth. And at around 1 a.m, on the last day of 1862, the red light disappeared. That was the moment. When the lantern winked out, the men watching understood the ship was gone. 16 men went with her. 46 were pulled from the sea. The wreck settled to the bottom about 16 miles off Cape Hatteras, in deep water well beyond the shoals. And that is the thing to hold on to. The Monitor never touched Diamond Shoals. She did not run aground. She was not driven onto a bar. She died in open water off the Cape, killed by nothing more exotic than the ordinary rough sea this place breeds, when the wind and the currents fight each other. The most advanced warship on the planet, a vessel that had made the world's navies obsolete, undefeated by any enemy, was undone by the plain fact of where she was. Cannon could not sink the Monitor. Cape Hatteras did it in a single night. That is the reversal, and it is the first hard proof of the pattern this whole coast keeps repeating. Better technology does not exempt you here. It only changes the shape of the ship the sea takes down. The loss landed hard on the Union. The Monitor was not just any ship. She was a symbol. The vessel that had saved the blockade at Hampton Roads and announced a new age of naval power, and to lose her not to enemy guns, but to a winter gale off a sandbar at the very end of 1862 was a bitter and almost embarrassing kind of blow. And then she was simply gone. Not just sunk, but lost. Her exact resting place unknown for over a century, a famous ship swallowed so completely by this coast that for generations no one could say for certain where she lay. The Monitor stayed lost for more than a century, until 1973, when researchers finally located and identified the wreck on the bottom off Hatteras. And what happened next tells you how seriously this ship is taken. In January of 1975, the site became the first national marine sanctuary in the United States, not a park on land. A protected shipwreck, guarded by the federal government, the first the country ever designated. The wreck that Cape Hatteras made became the reason the nation invented a whole category of protection for the things the sea drowns. Later expeditions raised pieces of her, including the Great Gun Turret, brought up in 2002, the very turret whose gap had let the sea pour in. The technology that killed her now sits in conservation tanks at a museum in Newport News, Virginia. The turret and the engine and the guns all lifted off the seabed and soaked for years to draw out the salt, studied and displayed precisely because of how completely this coast defeated it. And the recovery gave back one more thing, the thing that turns the Monitor from a machine into men. When the turret came up in 2002, it did not come up empty. Inside it, divers found human remains. 2 sailors, one lying partly across the other, men who had been caught inside that revolving iron drum when the ship rolled and went down in 1862, and who had lain there on the seabed, inside the turret, for 140 years. Forensic scientists worked for years to give them back their names, reconstructing their faces from their skulls, narrowing their ages, one a young man somewhere between his late teens and his mid-20s, the other older, in his 30s. The sea would not give up quite enough, and neither man could be certainly identified. The most the investigators could do was narrow the field to a short list of families whose ancestors had served aboard, and then stop, beaten by the same distance of years that the ocean always wins in the end. In March of 2013, 150 years after the Red Lantern went dark, those 2 unknown sailors were buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, the last of the Monitor's dead to come home, a century and a half late. 2 men who could not get out in time, finally out. But go back to that Red Lantern going dark, and to the question underneath it. If the seas off the Cape could kill even in deep water, and if the shoals themselves lay out there in the open ocean where you could not build a lighthouse because there was no land to build it on, then how do you warn ships about the single most dangerous patch of water on the coast? You cannot put a tower on the shoals. There is nothing to put it on. So the answer the government reached for was as bold as it was cruel to the men who had to carry it out. If you cannot build a light on the shoals, you anchor a ship on them. A permanent guardian, moored right at the edge of the killing ground, showing a light and later broadcasting a warning, sitting in the one spot every sane captain spent his whole career trying to avoid. You station men out there on purpose, and you leave them. That is what a lightship is. A vessel with no cargo, no destination, and no real purpose except to sit in a dangerous place and be seen. It carries a powerful light on a mast, and in the years we are about to talk about, it also carried a radio, and its entire job is to stay exactly where the danger is so that other ships know where not to go. It is bolted to the seabed by a massive anchor and a mile of chain. It does not sail anywhere. In good weather and bad, in fog and gale, the crew of a lightship rides at anchor in the worst water on the coast, on purpose, so that everyone else can stay in the good water. Off Cape Hatteras, the lightship that marked Diamond Shoals was one of the loneliest and most exposed postings in American maritime service, and the men who drew it spent weeks at a time anchored on the edge of the graveyard, rolling in seas that would send any sensible captain running for open water. Life aboard was a strange mix of monotony and dread. Day after day, the same horizon, the same endless rolling, the fog signal groaning out into the murk whenever the visibility closed down, the light burning at the masthead every night whether or not anyone out there could see it. The men tended the lamp, sounded the horn, kept the log, and rode the weather. And mostly nothing happened. Until something did. And when something did, they were anchored in the worst possible place on the coast to meet it. That was the bargain a lightship crew made. Total exposure in exchange for keeping everyone else safe. And it almost never worked cleanly, because keeping any marker anchored on Diamond Shoals was its own long war against the sea. Earlier attempts to hold a lightship on that station had been repeatedly defeated. Anchored vessels were dragged off their positions by storms, blown away, driven ashore, forced to run for their lives from the very weather they were stationed to endure, because a ship bolted to the bottom. In the worst water on the coast is a ship that cannot dodge anything. The station demanded a vessel strong enough to take a beating no sane captain would ever accept voluntarily, and men willing to sit inside that beating for weeks. Lightship duty anywhere was one of the grimmest jobs at sea, a life of violent rolling, isolation, and boredom, broken only by terror. And on Diamond Shoals it was worse than almost anywhere, because the whole point of the posting was to occupy the exact patch of ocean that everything else was trying to escape. That is the job the country asked 12 men to do in the summer of 1918. By the summer of 1918, the lightship on that station was Light Vessel Number 71 LV-71, with a crew of 12, 2 officers, 2 radio operators, and 8 other men. And that summer, something arrived off the Outer Banks that no lightship had ever been designed to face. The First World War had come across the Atlantic. Germany had sent long-range submarines all the way across the ocean to hunt in American coastal waters, and one of them, the U-140, a big ocean-going boat, was working the shipping off Cape Hatteras, sinking merchant vessels in the very waters the lightship was anchored to guard. It is worth pausing on how strange it was that a submarine was there at all. In 1918, Germany had built a handful of enormous long-range U-cruisers, boats big enough to cross the Atlantic and work for weeks off the American coast, and it sent them west, partly to sink ships and partly to prove it could reach right into American home waters and cause chaos 3,000 miles from Europe. They laid mines off the harbors and shelled vessels off the Outer Banks. And for a few weeks, a war most Americans pictured as belonging to France and the North Sea was suddenly happening within sight of North Carolina. The U-140 was one of those giants, which means the lightship men were facing a weapon that had no business being in their ocean, sent halfway around the world to do exactly the kind of damage that the concentration of shipping off Hatteras made so easy. Now hold the two ideas together, because the collision between them is the whole point. A lightship exists to broadcast the danger. A submarine survives by staying hidden. On the 6th of August 1918, the U-140 was shelling a merchant ship not far from the lightship's station, and the crew of LV-71 did exactly what they were there to do. They got on the radio and broadcast a warning, telling every ship within range that an enemy submarine was operating in these waters, and to keep clear. That is the job. That is the entire reason the vessel and its radio existed, to warn other ships away from a killer. By the accounts that come down to us, that warning did its work, and vessels that might have steamed straight into the U-140's path turned away because a lonely anchored ship on Diamond Shoals told them to. And that transmission is what killed LV-71, because the submarine's radio operators heard it too. The U-140 intercepted the lightship's warning, understood immediately that this anchored vessel was broadcasting its position and steering prey out of reach, and turned to silence it. Here is the trap closing, and it is a crueler version of everything we have already seen. The Monitor's low deck was the feature that made it deadly and the feature that killed it. The lightship's whole reason for existing, its fixed position and its warning radio, was now the thing that painted a target on it. And unlike any other ship on that coast, the lightship could not run. That was the point of it. It was anchored. It was designed to be unable to flee. The one vessel out there physically incapable of escape was the one the submarine chose to hunt, precisely because it would not leave, and precisely because it would not stop talking. The 12 men of LV-71 understood what was coming. They could not fight a submarine, and they could not sail away from one. What they could do was get off before the shells arrived. In the early afternoon, around 2:30, they lowered the ship's lifeboat, climbed down into it, and pulled away from the vessel that had been their home and their post. They did not have time to gather much, and then they did the only thing left to them. They rowed west toward the low line of the Outer Banks, toward Cape Hatteras, under their own muscle in an open boat, while behind them the U-140 opened fire on the abandoned lightship and shelled it until it sank. Row and watch. That is the image. 12 men bending over the oars, pulling for a shore roughly 5 miles off, keeping the boat's head into the sea so it would not turn broadside and roll them all into the water. And every time they looked back over their shoulders, they could see the shells striking the Guardian of Diamond Shoals, the ship whose warning had just saved other men, going down under enemy guns because it had done its duty too well. These were not young athletes. They were working lightship men who had just abandoned the only shelter they had in the middle of the ocean with an enemy submarine on the surface a few hundred yards away, and they spent the whole afternoon watching the ship they had served pounded to pieces for the crime of telling the truth over the radio. They rowed for hours, soaked and spent, and did not reach the beach until well into the evening, coming ashore near the Cape Hatteras wireless station around 9:30 at night. 7 hours in an open boat. Then somebody counted heads, 12 out, 12 back. Not a single man of LV-71 was lost. The ship itself holds a grim little distinction. LV-71 is the first and only United States lightship ever sunk by enemy action. And its death proved something new about this place, something the Monitor had only hinted at. Cape Hatteras does not only concentrate ships, it concentrates them so reliably, funnels so much traffic past one narrow point that the point itself becomes worth attacking. A submarine did not have to search the whole ocean for victims. It came to Hatteras, because everyone comes to Hatteras, and it found the traffic stacked up exactly where the geography forces it to stack up. The lightship was anchored on the busiest, most predictable choke point on the East Coast. That made it useful. It also made it, and everything around it, a hunting ground. Concentrate enough ships in one unavoidable place, and you have not only built a navigational trap, you have built an ambush that an enemy can simply come and wait inside. Remember that, because a generation later, it is going to happen again, on a scale that will make one lost lightship look like a footnote. But before we leave the summer of 1918, there is one more thing that happened here, 10 days after the lightship went down, and it answers a question we left hanging much earlier. We said the people who survived this coast were the ones who learned to read it, the watermen who knew the water and the swell, and when not to go. By 1918, that hard-won local knowledge had been organized into something formal, a chain of small stations strung down the Outer Banks manned by the United States Life-Saving Service and its surfmen, local men who lived on these islands and knew this water in their bones, whose job was to launch small boats into the surf and go out after wrecks. And on the 16th of August 1918, they were handed the worst kind of rescue there is. That chain of stations was not there by luck or foresight. It was there because of a specific pair of catastrophes 40 years earlier that shamed the country into building it. On a November night in 1877, the naval gunboat USS Huron ran aground in a storm barely 200 yards off the beach at Nag's Head, up the banks. 200 yards. You could very nearly throw a line to shore, and it did not matter because the surf was too violent to swim, and there was no one on the beach to help, because the life-saving stations in the area were closed for the season. The government ran them only part of the year to save money, and the crews were not due back until December. So the men of the Huron drowned within sight of dry land, and 98 of them died in the surf for want of a rescue crew that was not scheduled to exist yet. 2 months later, at the end of January 1878, it happened again. The steamer Metropolis stranded on a bar about 100 yards off the beach, farther up the banks, and again the surf and the cold did the killing. And again there was no rescue ready, and around 85 more people died. 2 disasters, a few weeks apart, both within shouting distance of shore, both down to the plain fact that the nation had decided saving these particular lives was a seasonal expense. This time the public would not stand for it. Congress finally opened its purse, funded more stations along the Outer Banks, and lengthened the months they were manned. The men who rowed out to the Merlot in 1918 were on that beach, in that season, with that boat, because 98 sailors had drowned off Nag's Head in 1877 to put them there. And it is worth knowing exactly what those surfmen did, because it was neither glamorous nor simple. They walked the beach on foot patrol through every night in all weather, watching for a ship in the wrong place or the flare of a distress rocket. When one struck, they had 2 ways to reach it. They could launch a surfboat straight out through the breakers, the thing that nearly killed them at the Merlot. Or if the wreck was close in but the surf was impossible, they used the beach apparatus. They fired a light line across the stranded ship with a small cannon called a Lyle gun. The crew aboard hauled on it to bring across a heavier rope, made it fast to the mast, and then the surfmen ran out a breeches buoy, a life ring with a pair of canvas trousers sewn into it, riding the rope like a zip line, and hauled the survivors ashore one at a time, swinging over the same surf that was breaking the ship apart beneath them. Slow, brutal, and in a bad sea the only chance anyone had. The finest hour of that service on this coast belongs to a station called Pea Island and a keeper named Richard Etheridge, and it is a story the country spent 100 years failing to honor. Etheridge had been born into slavery on the Outer Banks, served in the Union Army, and in 1880 became the first African-American keeper of a life-saving station anywhere in the United States. When he was given Pea Island, the white surfmen assigned there refused to serve under a black officer and walked off, so Etheridge built and drilled an all-black crew and made it one of the sharpest on the coast. On a night in October of 1896, the schooner E.S. Newman was driven ashore in a hurricane south of the station, and the sea was so wild that Etheridge judged it impossible to launch a boat at all. So he did something else. He tied a line to his 2 strongest men and sent them wading and swimming out through the breakers, roped to the shore and to their crewmates. To reach the wreck, lash themselves to 2 survivors at a time, and be hauled back through the surf. They went out and back again and again, by some accounts as many as 10 times, until every soul aboard the Newman, 9 people including a woman and a child, was on the beach alive. Not one was lost. It was one of the great rescues in the history of the service, and Etheridge and his men received no medal for it in their lifetimes. The gold life-saving medal did not reach the crew of Pea Island until 1996, a full century later, awarded to men 100 years dead. That is the caliber of person this coast produced, and the caliber of recognition it took 100 years to give. Hold that standard, because 10 days into August of 1918, it was about to be tested again, this time against fire. That afternoon, the same German submarine campaign claimed a British tanker called the Merlot, off Rodanthe, up the island chain from the Cape. Sources differ on whether she struck a mine the U-boat had laid or took a torpedo, but the result is not in dispute. Around 4:30 in the afternoon, an explosion tore into the Merlot, and because she was a tanker loaded with fuel, the sea itself caught fire. The ship broke apart in further explosions, and burning oil spread across the water in a spreading sheet of flame, with the survivors scattered among it in 3 lifeboats. Flames were reported shooting 100 feet into the air. This is a nightmare that has no good answer. The men in the water and the boats were surrounded by fire on the sea, and the shore was miles away across a heavy surf. At the Chicamacomico life-saving station, the keeper was a man named John Allen Midget, Jr., from one of the old Outer Banks families whose name is written all over the history of rescue on this coast. When the alarm went up, Midget and 5 of his surfmen launched their motor surf boat, a small self-bailing craft called number 1046, into a surf running 15 to 18 feet. Think about that before we go further. Before they could even begin to reach the burning tanker, they had to get their small boat out through breaking waves nearly 3 times the height of a man, and the surf threw them back. They tried again and again. 4 times they were driven back by the surf before they finally clawed their way through it and out to open water. And only then did the real problem begin, because now they had to cross to a ship surrounded by a wall of burning oil. And this is where local knowledge stops being a nice idea and becomes the difference between 42 men living and 42 men burning. Midget worked his boat around the fire, reading the flames and the shifting sheet of burning oil the way his people had always read the water, until he found a gap, an opening in the wall of flame, and took the boat through it to the lifeboats on the far side. There were more survivors than one small surf boat could ever carry at once. Some of them burned, all of them soaked in oil and seawater, so the surfmen ferried. They loaded the boat until it could take no more, pulled out to a steamer that had stood off at a safe distance, transferred the survivors, and turned straight back into the smoke for the next load. Trip after trip, 6 men from a sandbank island going in and out of the fire, until every man they could reach was out. It took hours. When it was done, they had carried 42 of the 51 men who had been aboard the Merlot out of a burning sea. For it, the 6 of them received gold life-saving medals, and later recognition from the British Crown, from King George V himself for saving a British crew. Sit with what that rescue tells you, because it is the counterweight to everything else in this story. The life-saving service had a saying, drawn from the spirit of its old regulations, that has never been improved upon. You have to go out. You do not have to come back. That was the actual standard these men worked to. The rule did not say come back safe. It said go out. Midget and his surfmen rode into fire under that rule and came back anyway, with 42 men who had no right to expect it. So when the whole rest of this story is about how technology and ambition keep failing against Cape Hatteras, keep this fixed in your mind. The thing that worked, the thing that actually pulled men out of the graveyard alive, was not a better engine or a stronger hull. It was 6 local men who knew the water, launched a small boat into an impossible surf, and went out. The human answer to this coast was never machinery. It was people willing to go out, and skilled enough to come back. The little station at Chicamacomico still stands up the beach at Rodanthe, kept now as a museum, the most complete life-saving station left on the coast. so that what those men did there stays on the record instead of drifting off into legend. And sometimes the sea took a ship here and left no story at all, only a riddle. In the last days of January 1921, a big five-masted schooner called the Carol A. Deering, homeward bound from Brazil toward Virginia, passed the Cape Lookout lightship down the coast and hailed it, her crew oddly milling about on the quarterdeck where crew were not normally allowed, calling across that she had lost her anchors in a storm. 2 days later, at dawn on the 31st, she was found hard aground on Diamond Shoals, sails still set. Driven up onto the very bank this whole story circles around. And she was empty. The surfmen who eventually got out to her found food laid out in the galley as if a meal were being made, and not one living soul, and no bodies. The ship's log, her navigation instruments, certain papers, and both lifeboats were gone. 11 men had simply vanished off a ship that sailed herself up onto the shoals and sat there waiting to be found. No one has ever explained it. There was a federal investigation pushed hard by the missing captain's own daughter, and it dragged on for months and produced nothing solid, only theories, mutiny, piracy, rum runners in those first years of Prohibition, when the water off this coast was thick with liquor smugglers, a storm that forced an abandonment that went wrong. A message in a bottle even turned up claiming the ship had been seized, and it set off a brief international panic before it was dismissed as a hoax. The crew was never found. No men, no boats, no answer. To this day, the Carol A. Deering is one of the great unsolved mysteries of the sea, and the thing to hold on to is not the mystery, but the address. Of all the water on the whole Atlantic coast, whatever befell those 11 men ended with their ship aground on Diamond Shoals, because that is where the currents and the coastline deliver everything in the end. The explained and the unexplained alike. But 6 men in a surfboat can only reach so far, and only when they can see the wreck, and only when the wreck is close enough to the beach that oars and a small motor can cross the distance in time. Push the disaster farther offshore, or hide it in weather, or multiply it past anything a handful of stations can answer, and even the surfmen run out of reach, which is exactly what the 20th century was about to do to Cape Hatteras. Because the traffic the Cape concentrated was about to become the most fought-over shipping in the world, and the enemy that sank one lightship in 1918 was about to come back in numbers nobody on these beaches could have imagined. The winter of 1942. The United States had been in the Second World War for barely a month, and along the whole East Coast the ordinary business of the sea was still running the way it always had. Tankers full of oil moving up from the refineries of the Gulf toward the northeast, and the ships bound for Europe. Freighters hauling cargo, coastal traffic, moving one ship at a time, on peacetime habits, along the same lane that had always squeezed past Cape Hatteras. And on the 13th of January 1942, Germany opened a campaign called Operation Drumbeat, and sent its submarines straight across the Atlantic to feed on that traffic. They came, as everything comes, to Hatteras, because the geography had not changed. The Cape still reached out and pulled every ship into the same narrow lane, and now that lane had become the richest hunting ground for submarines anywhere in the world. The Germans had a name for how those first months felt from inside a submarine. They called it the happy time, the second happy time, the American shooting season. The man who sent them, Admiral Karl Dönitz, had grasped something simple and devastating. The United States had spent 2 years watching Britain fight the U-boats, and had still arrived at its own war almost completely unready to defend its own coast. Too few escort ships, too few patrol aircraft, no coastal convoy system, and a peacetime habit of doing everything in the open, in the light, on schedule. So Dönitz sent his boats across 3,000 miles of ocean, and they surfaced off a coastline lit up as if there were no war at all, found ships steaming alone and unescorted, and helped themselves. Commanders later described lying on the surface at night, close enough to see the glow of the resort towns and the headlights of cars running the coastal roads, in no hurry at all, choosing their targets at leisure. Across the whole campaign, up and down the eastern seaboard, and into the Caribbean and the Gulf, they sank a staggering amount of shipping in a matter of months, by some counts well over 600 vessels and more than 3 million tons of cargo and fuel, a blow that in that stretch of 1942 rivaled the losses of Pearl Harbor and did lasting damage to the war effort. And the single richest killing ground in that entire slaughter, the water the U-boat commanders came back to again and again, was off Cape Hatteras. Of course it was. It was where the ships were, because it is always where the ships are. The sailors gave the waters off the Outer Banks a new name that year, Torpedo Junction. And what happened there in the first half of 1942 is one of the least remembered catastrophes in American history, a slaughter that happened within sight of vacation beaches. Roughly 60 ships were sunk off the North Carolina coast alone in those months, part of hundreds lost up and down the eastern seaboard. And for a while the U-boat crews could hardly believe their luck, because the Americans, unready for a war on their own doorstep, were making it easy in a way that is genuinely hard to forgive, and the cargo made the timing unbearable. The ships being picked off were, many of them, tankers hauling oil and gasoline up from the Gulf refineries to the ports that fueled the war and loaded the convoys to Britain. This was not incidental freight. It was the lifeblood of the entire Allied effort, and it had to move up the coast past Hatteras because that was the route. So the same geography that had wrecked sailing ships for 300 years now funneled the most strategically vital shipping in the country into a lane where submarines could take it apart. At the precise moment the nation could least afford to lose a drop of it, the value of the route and the danger of the route were, once again, the very same fact. Here is the failure, and it is a human one, not a natural one. For months, the coastal towns kept their lights on. The boardwalks, the hotels, the streets, the whole glowing electric edge of the American shore stayed lit through the night because turning the lights off meant hurting the tourist season and the coastal economy. And nobody wanted to be the one to order the coast dark. And the ships kept steaming individually, without escorts, without the protection of convoys, often with their own running lights burning, along a predictable line close to shore. Put those two things together and you get the most grotesque advantage in the history of naval warfare. At night, a ship passing Hatteras was lit from behind by the glow of the land. It stood out against the bright coast like a target pinned to a lit screen. The U-boats simply lay out in the dark water offshore, where there was no light behind them, and waited for the silhouettes to slide across the glow, and fired. The land itself, the same coast whose lighthouse was built to save ships, was now backlighting them for the enemy. For the people living on the Outer Banks, that winter and spring turned their quiet beaches into the front line of a world war, and they could not look away from it. They watched explosions light the horizon at night. They dragged oil-soaked survivors out of the surf and took them into their own homes. They found lifeboats, debris, and bodies washed up among the shells in the morning, and they buried strangers in their own cemeteries. Children walked to school past wreckage on the sand. The war the rest of the country followed in newspapers was, for these islanders, happening in the front yard, close enough to hear and smell and bury. And because so many of the victims were tankers, the sea burned. Survivors and shore witnesses described flaming oil spreading across the water, tankers burning so brightly at night that people on the beach said you could read a newspaper by the light of them. In the mornings, the beaches of the Outer Banks were fouled with oil, with wreckage, and with the bodies of merchant sailors who had died within a few miles of an American vacation shore. This was not the far North Atlantic. This was happening where families swam in the summer, and it kept happening, week after week. because the response was slow and the geography was merciless, and the two together were catastrophic. And the men doing the dying were mostly not Navy sailors but merchant crews, civilians hauling cargo and fuel for wages. A service that would come out of the war having suffered proportionally one of the heaviest death rates of any American force in it. A brutal share of that toll was paid in these first few months of 1942, and a great deal of that share was paid in the water off this single cape. And because these were not statistics but ships full of men, take two of them, because they carry things the numbers cannot. On the morning of the 26th of March, 1942, an American tanker called the Dixie Arrow was steaming up toward the Cape, alone and unarmed, carrying close to 100,000 barrels of crude oil out of Texas. A German submarine put 3 torpedoes into her starboard side in about a minute, and a tanker full of crude does not so much sink as detonate. Fire swept the length of her almost at once. 7 men were trapped forward, on the bow, with the wind driving a wall of burning oil straight back over the deck toward them, and the sea itself alight all around the hull. There was no way out for them, and at the wheel, in a wheelhouse already burning, was an able seaman named Oscar Chappell, bleeding from the head, and he understood in a few seconds what he could do and what it would cost. He put the helm hard over. He turned the ship deliberately, so that her burning length swung the wind and the flames away from the 7 men on the bow and opened them a path to jump clear into the water. But turning the ship meant standing at the wheel, and standing at the wheel meant staying in the fire. The 7 men lived. Chappell did not. His body was never recovered, and he was later awarded posthumously the Merchant Service's highest decoration for it. He was not a naval hero, he was a civilian sailor steering an oil tanker up the coast, and he spent the last half-minute of his life turning a burning ship with his own hands so that other men could live. That is who was dying off these beaches in 1942. And it was not only Americans. This is the part almost no one hears. When Torpedo Junction was at its worst, and the United States had almost nothing to fight submarines with, the British, who had years of hard experience, sent help across the Atlantic, including armed fishing trawlers and their crews, to patrol the American coast. One of them was His Majesty's trawler Bedfordshire, a small anti-submarine trawler manned by British and Canadian sailors, working the water off the Outer Banks. On the night of the 11th of May, 1942, the submarine U-5558 found her off Ocracoke and fired 2 torpedoes. The first missed. The second did not. The Bedfordshire went down with every man aboard, all 37 of them, and there was no rescue, because at first no one even knew she was gone. In the days that followed, bodies began to come ashore on Ocracoke, and the islanders, the same kind of Outer Banks people who had always dealt with what the sea delivered, recovered 4 of them and buried them in a small plot of island ground. That ground was later granted to Britain in perpetuity, and it is now the Ocracoke British Cemetery, said to be the smallest Commonwealth war grave in the world, a tiny square of England on a North Carolina sandbar, holding 4 men who crossed an ocean to defend a coast that was not theirs and were killed by the same trap that had been killing everyone else for 400 years. One man of the Bedfordshire's crew survived only because he had missed her last sailing, held ashore over some trouble with the local police. Everyone who actually sailed died. The 4 recovered graves are still there, on that seated square of ground, tended by the island, and every May the people of Ocracoke and representatives of both navies still gather over them for a memorial service that has been kept up for more than 80 years. The men who crossed an ocean to defend a coast that was not theirs were never taken home. The coast simply kept them, and the island adopted them. There is a hard symmetry in that, and it sharpens the whole point of this place. The submarine came to Hatteras to exploit the funnel. The trawler came to Hatteras to defend it. And the water took them both, the Hunter and the Guardian, and laid them on the same bottom, exactly as it had taken the ironclad that fought for the Union, and the light ship that tried to warn everyone, and the tanker sailor who turned into the fire. Cape Hatteras does not care whose side you are on, or what you meant to do. It only cares that you are there. Now sit with what this proves, because it is a genuine turn in the story. Up to now, Cape Hatteras has been a natural machine. Currents, shoals, waves, fog. Torpedo Junction is the moment you learn that the trap does not need weather at all. The very thing that makes this place dangerous in a storm, the way it concentrates every ship into one unavoidable lane, is dangerous even on a calm, clear night, because concentration itself is the hazard. Funnel enough ships through one predictable point, and you do not need a gale to kill them. You just need someone or something waiting at the choke. The geography that gathers ships for the shoals to wreck is the same geography that gathered them for the submarines to burn. Different killer, identical trap. And this time the trap was baited by a human decision, the refusal to turn off the lights, which is why Torpedo Junction should make you angry in a way the storms do not. Nature built the funnel. People lit the targets. And for months, the American public was barely allowed to know any of it. The government, afraid of panic and unwilling to advertise how naked the coast really was, kept the scale of the sinkings quiet, censored the reports, played down the burning ships that people standing on the beaches could see with their own eyes. Families of merchant sailors sometimes learned their men were dead only when the men failed to come home. So this was not merely a slaughter. It was a hidden one, unfolding in plain sight off crowded shores, its true size withheld from the country it was bleeding. The sea off Hatteras took hundreds of men that spring, while the nation was told, in effect, to look the other way. But this stretch of the story also contains the first time in this whole account that the trap bites back at the thing hunting inside it. And it happened off Hatteras too. By April of 1942, the Navy was beginning to adapt. Blackouts were being imposed on the coast. Convoys were being organized. Patrols were going out. And on the night of the 14th of April, 1942, an old destroyer, the USS Roper, was working the water off the Outer Banks between Wimble Shoals and Cape Hatteras when her instruments picked up a contact on the surface about 20 miles off the Cape. It was the U-85, one of the submarines that had been hunting these waters. For the first time in this story, the technology on the hunting side of the equation actually worked. The Roper detected the submarine, ran it down in the dark, and when the range closed, she opened fire, scoring hits, and then, as the stricken U-boat went under, she ran over the spot and released a pattern of depth charges into the water to be certain. The U-85 was destroyed. Its entire crew, more than 40 men, was lost. It was the first German submarine sunk in American waters, and the first submarine kill by a United States destroyer in the whole war, and it happened in the same few square miles that had killed the Monitor and drowned the lightship and burned the Mirlo. There is the reversal you have been waiting for. For a generation, the predator came to Hatteras because Hatteras delivered victims. And now, off the same cape, the predator became the victim, run down and sunk in the dark, its crew ending up on the same seabed as the merchant sailors it had been sent to kill. The U-85 is still down there. Divers have since recovered artifacts from the wreck on the bottom, and by some accounts even a cipher machine came up out of that grave. The submarine that came to exploit the trap is now part of the graveyard it came to feed. There is something almost unbearable about that seabed when you think about what lies on it together. Within a few miles of one another, on the bottom off this single cape, rest a Civil War ironclad, a sunken lightship, torpedoed tankers, a British trawler that crossed an ocean to help defend a coast that was not its own, a German submarine and its dead crew, and the scattered, nameless wreckage of centuries of sailing ships. Different flags, different wars, different centuries, all delivered to the same few square miles of sand by the same set of forces, and all kept. Divers go down on some of them now. Several are protected war graves. The graveyard is not a figure of speech. It is a real place on the chart, layered almost like rock, and every layer was laid down by the same trap, and it keeps them. Everything that goes down off this cape stays down, hunter and hunted together, added to the same pile on the same bottom. That, in the end, is all the word graveyard has ever meant here. That single sinking was the hinge, and after it the tide of the whole campaign began to turn, though not because of any one clever weapon. It turned because the country finally did the obvious, unglamorous things it should have done from the start. The coast went dark at last. The beach towns dimmed down, and the ships stopped silhouetting themselves against the glow. Convoys were organized, so merchant ships moved in escorted groups instead of alone. Aircraft began patrolling the lanes, forcing the submarines down and away from their easy shots. None of it was ingenious. All of it was overdue. And within months, the killing off Hatteras fell away. The U-boats drifted off to easier hunting elsewhere, and Torpedo Junction quieted into the guarded, uneasy shipping lane it stayed for the rest of the war. The lesson the Navy drew was that the slaughter had been a failure of preparation and discipline, not of technology, and they were right. But being right about that is exactly what baited the trap for the century to come, because it taught everyone that the problem here was solvable, that with enough gear and enough discipline, this water could finally be mastered. And yet, notice what actually changed and what did not, because this is the thread that carries us into the modern world. The Ropers' success was a technology success. Detection gear found the submarine in the dark. Better organization put a warship in the right water. Convoys and blackouts eventually shut Torpedo Junction down, and the slaughter of 1942 was brought under control by human ingenuity and human effort. That is real, and it matters. The tools worked. But the tools did not touch the underlying thing. The Cape still reached out into the traffic. The currents still collided. The shoals still shifted, and the fog still formed, and the seas still stacked up steep and confused over the banks. All the technology did was win a particular fight against a particular enemy. The trap itself, the geography and the water, was exactly where it had always been, waiting for the next thing that had to pass. And the effort to guard the shoals themselves did not end when LV-71 went down under German shells. They kept at it. Another lightship went back onto Diamond Shoals Station after the First World War, and another after that. Generation after generation of vessels anchored on the killing ground, until the Coast Guard decided that leaving men bolted to the worst water on the coast in all weather was a job machines should finally take over. In 1966, they finished the thing that was supposed to solve it for good, not a ship this time, a tower. Diamond Shoals Light, one of a handful of so-called Texas towers built off the East Coast. A steel platform standing on legs, driven into the seabed about 13 miles off Cape Hatteras. Planted right out over the shoals, where no ordinary lighthouse could ever stand. It cost around $2 million. It had crew quarters with 8 bedrooms, and it was handed to its first Coast Guard crew in the autumn of 1966. A permanent, manned, storm-proof light sitting directly on Diamond Shoals at last. This was the answer, or it looked like the answer. As a manned station, it lasted about 11 years. In 1977, they automated it and took the crew off, because living on a steel platform in the middle of that sea was punishing and expensive and, by then, unnecessary, since machines could tend the light. And then technology did something stranger to the tower than any storm could. It made the whole idea pointless. By the end of the century, ships no longer needed a light on the shoals to know where the shoals were, because they had satellites. A receiver the size of a paperback book could now put a vessel's exact position on a screen anywhere on Earth, in any darkness, in any fog. And a $2 million tower whose entire purpose was to stand up and say, "Here are the shoals," had nothing left to say that the satellite could not say better. In 2001, the Coast Guard declared Diamond Shoals Light obsolete, switched off the beacon, and abandoned it. The tower was eventually sold off to a private bidder for about the price of a used car. Follow that arc for a moment. From a wooden ship anchored on the shoals with men living aboard, to a steel fortress with 8 bedrooms, to a dark, rusting, empty platform sold to a hobbyist, all inside one human lifetime. Every kind of guardian we knew how to build was, in the end, sunk, retired, or made irrelevant. The shoals are still there. They never needed guarding for their own sake. They were always going to outlast whatever we bolted on top of them. So here is the question that should be burning in you now, because it is the one the second half of this story exists to answer. By the end of the 20th century, we had everything. Radar that sees through the dark and the fog. Engines powerful enough to drive a ship into any sea. Radio, and then satellite communication that can carry a distress call around the planet in an instant. Weather satellites that watch every storm form days in advance, and forecasts that can tell a captain a hurricane is coming and roughly where it will go. We had solved, one by one, every specific problem that had killed the ships in this story. The Monitor had no forecast. The lightship could not run. The merchant sailors of 1942 had no escort and no dark coast to hide against. All of that is fixed now. Modern crews have all of it. So does the trap finally close? With every one of those tools in hand, can a modern crew, warned days in advance, tracked by satellite, able to call for help that arrives by helicopter, finally beat the one bend of low sand that beat everyone before them? Or does Cape Hatteras have an answer even for that? To find out, you have to come almost to the present day, to the night of the 29th of October, 2012, and to a ship that everyone could see coming, in a storm that everyone knew about, sailing into the exact water that has been killing crews in this story for 150 years. The ship was called the Bounty. A 3-masted wooden tall ship, square-rigged, the kind of vessel that belongs to the age of the Monitor's grandfather, not to the 21st century. And that is almost what she was, because this Bounty was a replica, built in 1960 in Nova Scotia for the 1962 film about the mutiny on the original HMS Bounty. For half a century afterward, she sailed as a working piece of history, a wooden ship kept afloat by constant care because a wooden hull is never truly watertight. It always weeps a little, and you keep ahead of it with pumps, day in and day out, forever. Remember that detail. A wooden ship stays up only as long as the pumps stay ahead of the water. We have heard that arithmetic before, on the Monitor, 150 years earlier. It is about to come back exactly. In late October of 2012, the Bounty was in New London, Connecticut, and her captain was a man named Robin Walbridge, 63 years old, an experienced tall ship sailor who had commanded her for years. And bearing down on the entire eastern seaboard was Hurricane Sandy, one of the most thoroughly forecast storms in American history. This is the thing you have to fix in your mind before anything else. Nobody was surprised by Sandy. The satellites had been watching it for days. Every forecaster in the country was tracking an enormous storm climbing up the coast, and its size and path were on every screen and every broadcast. Walbridge had every piece of information the Monitor's captain never had. He knew the storm was coming. He knew roughly how big it was, and he knew roughly where it was going. And on the 25th of October, he sailed the Bounty out of New London and turned her south toward St. Petersburg, Florida, directly toward the coast the hurricane was climbing. There are things about the Bounty herself that matter here because a wooden ship is only ever as safe as the care poured into her. And this one was tired. She had been built as a movie prop in 1960, not as a vessel meant to work for another century, and by 2012 keeping her afloat was a constant, costly fight against rot and opening seams. Investigators would later raise pointed questions about her condition and about how much water she habitually took on even in ordinary weather. Aboard for this passage were 16 people, a mix of a few seasoned hands and a number of younger, greener crew, the kind of company a working tall ship tends to carry. None of that made what happened inevitable, but it means the ship heading toward a hurricane was not a fresh, tight hull with a hardened crew and a wide margin of safety. She was an aging wooden vessel that already had to be pumped to stay dry, carrying people who trusted the judgment of the man who had decided to go. Why? This is where you have to be fair, because it is easy to call it madness and harder to understand it. Walbridge held to a piece of old sailor's doctrine, a genuinely defensible one in the right circumstances, that a ship is safer at sea than trapped in port during a storm. A wooden ship pinned against a dock in a hurricane can be smashed to pieces against the pilings as the surge lifts and drops her. At sea, the reasoning goes, you have room to maneuver, room to take the weather on your own terms. And Walbridge's stated plan was not to sail into the hurricane, but around it, to use the ship's speed and the storm's predicted track to slip down the backside of it, to stay in the weaker western semicircle and let the worst of it pass to the east. On paper, to a confident captain who had spent his life reading weather and handling this ship, it was not insane. It was a calculated bet that he could use the same forecast everyone else was looking at to thread a path the storm would leave open. For the first days, it seemed to be working. The Bounty had left New London on the 25th and worked her way south and east, and Walbridge kept in contact with shore, with the ship's owner and eventually the Coast Guard, tracking the storm and adjusting course to stay on what he judged the safer side of it. But a wooden hull driven hard through a rising sea works and flexes, and flexing wooden seams let in water. And over those days, the amount coming aboard climbed past anything normal and kept climbing. And the crew's pumping watches grew longer and longer. Somewhere in there, the passage quietly stopped being a clever end run around a hurricane and became something older and simpler, a race between the water coming in and the machinery fighting to throw it back out. The forecast was right, the bet was wrong, and the place where the bet came due was, of course, off Cape Hatteras, because a hurricane is not a neat spinning disk you can tiptoe around. Sandy was enormous, its field of dangerous wind and monstrous sea spreading out hundreds of miles from the center. And as the Bounty worked south, she did not slip past the storm. She sailed into its reach, into exactly the kind of towering, chaotic sea that this coast breeds and a hurricane multiplies, off exactly the cape that has been the hinge of this entire story. And now the old arithmetic started to run. The wooden hull, worked and flexed by enormous seas, began taking on water faster than a weeping wooden ship ever should. The crew went to the pumps. And here the 21st century did something the Monitor's crew would have recognized instantly and envied bitterly, and then lost anyway. The Bounty had powerful modern pumps, engines, generators. For a while they threw the water back, but as the sea rose inside her, the water reached the machinery, and as it climbed it began to knock out the engines and the generators. And when the power failed, the pumps failed with it. Water coming in, pumps throwing it out, and then the water reaches the fires. Only now the fires are diesel generators, and the result is identical. The pumps stop. The number that was supposed to stay large collapses, and a ship full of water has only one direction left to go. There is a cruel geometry in where all this was unfolding. The Bounty was not near a harbor she could duck into. She was well out to sea off the Cape, in the open Atlantic, which was exactly where Walbridge had meant to be, on the theory that sea room is safety, and sea room is safety right up until the ship begins to fail, at which point sea room becomes distance, and distance becomes the enemy, because every mile of open water between the ship and the coast is another mile that rescue has to fight across in a hurricane. The very choice that was supposed to keep her clear of the storm was the choice that put her out of easy reach the moment the storm began to win. By the night of the 28th, Walbridge understood the Bounty was in serious trouble, and here modern technology did work, in the one way it always can. He got word out. The ship was in contact with the outside world, with her owner, and with the Coast Guard, by satellite communication, describing her situation and position. This is the thing the lightship's radio did in 1918, and the thing every ship in this story before the 20th century simply could not do. The Bounty could reach across the storm and say, "Here we are in trouble," in a way that reached rescuers hundreds of miles away in minutes. The distress reached the United States Coast Guard, and the machinery of modern rescue began to turn. And you need to understand exactly what that machinery is and what it is not, because this is the heart of the modern illusion, that a received distress call is the same as rescue. It is not. It is only the beginning of a chain, and every link in that chain has to survive the same storm that is sinking the ship. And here's the part of modern rescue that no satellite has ever made easier. Somebody has to decide to send people out into it. When the Bounty's distress reached the Coast Guard, it did not summon a machine. It summoned other human beings, air crews who would have to fly into the outer bands of Hurricane Sandy in the dark, in helicopters, and a fixed-wing plane being thrown around by the very winds that were sinking the ship. That is a decision a commander has to make and air crews have to accept. The deliberate choice to put your own people into the exact danger that is killing the people who called for help. There is nothing automatic about it. It is a judgment made under pressure about how much risk to the rescuers is worth, how much chance for the rescued. It gets made every single time. It got made that night. It starts with recognition. Someone has to receive the call and grasp what it means, and the Coast Guard did. Then authorization and preparation. Aircraft and crews have to be readied and cleared to launch into a hurricane, which is never a routine thing to sign off on. Then travel. From Coast Guard Air Station Elizabeth City, on the North Carolina mainland, aircraft had to fly out over the water into the edge of Hurricane Sandy in darkness. The Coast Guard first put up a C-130, a big fixed-wing plane, to find the Bounty and stay overhead, because before you can lift anyone out of the ocean, you first have to locate a wooden ship and a scattering of small rafts in a storm-torn sea in the dark, and that is its own desperate search. And while the aircraft were still on their way, the point of no return arrived on the Bounty, faster and more violently than any orderly plan could keep up with. Walbridge had intended to hold on through the night and get his people off in a controlled way at first light, when the helicopters could see. The sea did not grant him that. The crew were already in their survival suits, the thick, insulated coveralls that keep a body alive in cold water, mustering to abandon ship by the book, when in the small hours of the 29th, in mountainous seas, the Bounty rolled hard and went over, heeling so violently that she threw them off her canted, streaming decks into the black water before the life rafts were properly clear. 16 people went into the Atlantic in a hurricane off Cape Hatteras, in the dark, scattered, some reaching the rafts, some flung into the open sea, being swept apart by waves the size of houses. Those survival suits are the main reason most of them were still alive when the sun came up. The cold alone, in the open ocean in late October, would have finished the work long before any aircraft arrived. The mission was no longer to save the ship. The ship was gone. The only thing left was the oldest task in this story, the one the men of the Monitor faced and the men of the Lightship faced, to keep human beings alive in water that wants them dead. Now the rescue chain reaches its hardest link, the one that no amount of technology has ever been able to remove. Approach and transfer. The C-130 found them at first light, spotting the life rafts and survivors in the enormous seas. Then the helicopters came, MH-60 Jayhawks out of Elizabeth City, flying into hurricane winds to hover over the rafts. And here's the thing people who have never thought about rescue do not understand. The helicopter cannot simply pluck people out from a safe distance. To get a person out of a life raft in those seas, the Coast Guard has to put one of its own human beings into the water. A rescue swimmer drops from the aircraft down into the same hurricane sea that is killing the crew, swims to the raft, and one by one prepares the survivors and sends them up on the hoist while the helicopter fights to hold position in winds that are trying to throw it out of the sky. The rescuer enters the exact danger of the victims. That has been true on this coast since 6 men rowed a surfboat into burning oil off Rodanthe in 1918, and it was still true, precisely and physically true, in 2012. The technology got the aircraft there. A person still had to go into the water. The first Jayhawk reached the scene around 6:30 in the morning and hoisted 5 people out of the sea. A second helicopter came and lifted 9 more, its rescue swimmer working the rafts one survivor at a time, the last of them hoisted only minutes before the Bounty finally went under. The 2 Coast Guard aviation survival technicians who dropped into that sea to do the pulling, Randy Haba and Daniel Todd, would later be honored internationally for what they did that morning. 14 people, brought up one at a time out of a hurricane off Cape Hatteras and flown back to Elizabeth City with injuries but alive. By any measure, it was an extraordinary rescue, a display of exactly what modern capability can do that no earlier era could have dreamed of. 14 human beings who would simply have died in any previous century were alive because of satellites and aircraft and trained swimmers willing to jump into a hurricane. And it is no accident that the same word keeps surfacing in this story. The Coast Guard that flew those helicopters is the direct descendant of the life-saving service whose surfmen rowed into the Merlot's fire in 1918. The 2 services, along with the old lighthouse service that tended the tower and the lightships, were folded together into the modern Coast Guard in the early 20th century. So the rescue swimmer dropping out of a Jayhawk into Hurricane Sandy and John Allen Midget hauling on an oar into a wall of burning oil are, in institution and in spirit, the same people. A century apart, working the same water under the same brutal rule, go out. The machinery around them changed almost beyond recognition. The job did not change at all, and it was not enough to save everyone, because the sea sets the terms, and the sea had already taken its margin. 2 people did not come home. Claudine Christian, 42 years old, a member of the crew, was found in the water unresponsive and could not be revived. And Captain Robin Walbridge, 63, the man who had made the decision to sail, was never found at all. The Coast Guard searched for 4 days across roughly 12,000 square miles of ocean, an area you can barely picture, and found no trace of him. He is out there still, somewhere off the Cape, on the same seabed as the Monitor's dead, and the U-85's crew and 150 years of ships that thought they could pass this place on their own terms. Afterward came the investigations, and their conclusions matter, because they tell you what this disaster proved that none of the others could. The National Transportation Safety Board examined everything and named as the probable cause the captain's reckless decision to sail the Bounty into the well-forecast path of Hurricane Sandy. Not a freak wave nobody could have seen, not a mechanical fault nobody could have predicted, not the fog that blinded the sailors of the age of sail. A decision, made with a good forecast in hand. A separate Coast Guard investigation reached a similar place, faulting the decision to sail and the way the aging wooden ship had been run and maintained. And there is the reversal that closes the loop this whole second half has been holding open. We asked whether modern forecasting could finally beat the trap. The answer the bounty gives is brutal in its simplicity. The forecast was not wrong. The forecast was perfect. Everyone knew the storm was coming, knew its size, knew its track. The technology did everything it was supposed to do, and it still could not save the ship, because a forecast, no matter how accurate, cannot make the decision for the human being holding it. The one thing all our instruments still cannot do is force a captain to stay in port. The consequences reached well past the two graves. The Bounty had not been a cargo ship or a warship. She was a piece of living history that carried paying crew and visitors, one vessel in a whole world of tall ships that sailed today for education and spectacle, and her loss drove hard questions through that entire community about who bears responsibility when a romantic old wooden ship meets a modern storm. There were lawsuits. There was grief that curdled into anger, above all, from the family of Claudine Christian, who had trusted the ship and her captain with her life. And the investigators left almost nowhere to hide because they did not blame a mechanical fluke or an unforeseeable rogue wave. They blamed a choice. The lesson was not build a stronger hull. The lesson was that a sound ship and a willing crew and every modern tool ever invented are worth nothing against this coast. The instant a person decides to sail into a storm they were warned about in precise detail, that is the modern form of the trap, and it is worse than the old one, not better. The Monitor's crew died partly because they did not know. The Bounty's captain sailed because knowing was not the same as being stopped. We removed ignorance from the equation and discovered that ignorance was never the whole problem. The whole problem was that Cape Hatteras sits in the doorway of a route people have reasons to take, and human confidence, the same confidence that sent an ironclad around the Cape at the end of a rope and kept the coastal lights burning in 1942, will always find a reason to enter the water. Better information does not cure that. Sometimes it feeds it, because the better your tools, the more sure you are that you can thread the needle the tools are showing you. So let us put the machine together one last time, not as a list of disasters, but as a single mechanism, because you have now seen every part of it working in its own century, and the parts have never actually changed. Geography builds the frame. Cape Hatteras reaches out into the deep Atlantic and squeezes the entire north-south traffic of the coast into one narrow, unavoidable lane. That is the constant underneath everything. It is why the Monitor had to round the Cape, why the merchant tankers had to pass it, why a submarine could come and simply wait, why the Bounty found herself off exactly this point when the storm caught her. Everyone comes here because the coast gives them no other way through. Weather arms the frame. A calm day off Hatteras is genuinely calm, but this is where the continental weather systems and the ocean's two great currents argue. And when the wind turns against the current, or a low deepens, or a hurricane climbs the coast, the sea here turns faster and steeper and more confused than the same wind would raise anywhere else. The storm does not have to be historic. The Monitor died in a winter gale, not a hurricane. The place takes ordinary bad weather and sharpens it, and the weather comes from two directions in two seasons, so there is no long, safe window. In summer and fall, it is hurricanes, climbing up from the tropics along the warm water. In winter, it is nor'easters, big cold storms that spin up off the coast and throw days of hard northeast wind straight onto the Cape. The Monitor did not die in a hurricane. She died in a December gale. The two seasons mean there is no quiet half of the year here, no stretch you can count on. The threats simply trade places on the calendar. The water supplies the force. The Gulf Stream and the cold Virginia Drift collide right at the point, and out of that collision comes everything that actually kills. The shifting shoals, rebuilt every year so no chart can hold them. The steep breaking seas, where deep swell trips over shallow sand. The sudden fog, where warm, wet air slides across cold water and erases the world. This is why the danger is invisible until it is on you. It is not a cliff you can see and avoid. It is a process, running continuously, that manufactures new hazards faster than anyone can map them. Human need supplies the exposure. Nobody dies at Cape Hatteras by accident of merely being nearby. They die because they had a reason to be in that water, cargo to move, a blockade to reach, oil to carry in a war, a schedule to keep, a ship to deliver, a port to make by a certain date. The Cape is deadly precisely because it sits astride a route that is too valuable to abandon. Dangerous and necessary are the same fact here. That is why the traffic never stopped, in any century, no matter how many wrecks piled up on the bars. And the exposure has not shrunk with time. If anything, it has grown, only in gentler-looking clothes. The oil and the cargo still move, but now they share this water with a summer coast full of people who come precisely because the place is beautiful and famous, drawn by the same wild ocean that made it a graveyard. Charter boats run out to the edge of the Gulf Stream to fish the exact convergence that builds the shoals. Yachts heading south each autumn thread the Cape the way sailing traders once did. The reasons for being here have multiplied, from cargo and combat to sport and scenery, but the effect is identical. More people, more hulls, more crossings, all pulled toward the one bend of coast that has been killing them the whole time. Technology changes the weapons, but never disarms the trap. This is the part that should stay with you, because it is the least intuitive and the most important. Every single specific problem that killed the ships in this story has, at some point, been solved. The Monitor had no way to know a gale was coming. Now we have forecasts. The lightship could not run and could not call for help fast enough. Now we have engines and satellites. The sailors of 1942 had no escort and stood lit against the shore. Now we have radar and convoy discipline and a dark, disciplined coast in wartime. Each generation fixed the exact thing that killed the last one. And the graveyard kept filling anyway, because none of those fixes touched the frame. Radar sees the fog but cannot move the shoals. An engine drives you through the sea but can carry you deeper into it. A satellite sends your distress call around the planet in a second, but cannot shorten the hours it takes a helicopter to fight its way out to you. A perfect forecast tells you exactly where the storm will be and cannot make you stay in port. The tools keep getting better at everything except the one thing that matters, which is the geography itself. And the geography is not going anywhere. Look hard at that word, better, because the whole illusion hides inside it. Yes, a modern ship can see in the dark now. Radar paints the coast and the traffic and the squalls onto a screen in the wheelhouse. And it is genuinely miraculous next to a man straining his ears for the sound of surf in the fog. But radar cannot move a sandbar out of your path, and it cannot calm a breaking sea, and it cannot add a single inch to the depth of water over Diamond Shoals. GPS can fix your position to within a few feet anywhere on Earth, which is exactly why they finally switched the light tower off. But knowing precisely where you are is not the same as being somewhere safe. The Bounty's crew knew exactly where they were the entire time they were sinking. Every tool we have built answers the question the last disaster asked and leaves the deeper one untouched, because the deeper one was never really about information. It was about force and distance and a piece of geography that does not care in the slightest what you know. There is one more thing worth being honest about, and it is the closest thing to a real solution this whole story contains. The way the modern world actually handles Cape Hatteras is not by conquering it, but by going around it. Big commercial ships give diamond shoals a wide berth now, standing well out to sea and swinging around the entire hazard, rather than threading the old inshore lane. Because the safest answer anyone has ever found to this place is simply to keep away from it. That works, and it is the quiet confession underneath all the technology. We did not master the Cape. We learned to avoid it. Which is exactly why the ones who still die here are the ones who, for one reason or another, did not or could not stay away. The small boat without the sea room to go around, the crew caught by weather before they could clear it, the captain who looked at the same forecast everyone else used to steer wide and decided he could thread it instead. Avoidance is the whole strategy, and avoidance only ever protects the people in a position to afford it. And rescue, the last hope in every one of these stories, runs into the hardest limit of all, the one that has not moved an inch in 100 years. Communication has become instant. Physical reach has not. The Bounty's distress call crossed hundreds of miles in minutes. The helicopter that answered it still had to fly, physically, into a hurricane, and a human being still had to drop out of that helicopter into the same sea that was drowning the crew, exactly as 6 surfmen had to row into burning oil in 1918. We have made it almost effortless to know that someone is dying off Cape Hatteras. We have made it no easier, in any fundamental way, to reach them across breaking water in the dark. The distance between hearing a cry and being able to answer it is still measured in the sea itself, and the sea off this cape is the same sea it always was, and it still happens. Not in the numbers of 1942, but the Coast Guard Air Station at Elizabeth City, the same base the Bounty's rescuers flew from, still watches a stretch of ocean off these banks larger than some entire countries, and its crews still launch in the season of nor'easters and the season of hurricanes, after fishing boats and freighters and weekend sailors who went out on a forecast that turned on them. Every one of those departures is a small bet, laid down on the same table where the Monitor and the Lightship and the Bounty laid down theirs. That is the answer to the question we started with, the one about why this one bend of low sand keeps killing crews good enough to survive anywhere else. It is not that the crews were not good enough. Many of them were superb. It is that Cape Hatteras is not a single hazard you can be skilled enough to beat. It is a system in which geography, weather, water, human need, and the limits of rescue all point at the same few square miles at the same time, and skill in one of them does not save you from the others. You can be a brilliant seaman and still be delivered to the shoals by a route you could not avoid. You can have a perfect forecast and still sail because you are human and confident and have somewhere to be. The place does not require you to make a mistake. It only requires you to be there. And notice that almost none of the people in this story were fools. The Monitor's officers knew their ship was low and wet, and went anyway because the Navy needed her and the first hard passage had not killed them. The merchant captains of 1942 followed peacetime routes because no one had yet forced them to do otherwise. Walbridge sailed on a doctrine that is genuinely sound in the right circumstances, with a plan that on paper could have worked. Every one of them made a decision that looked reasonable from the inside at the moment it was made, and the sea turned it into a catastrophe only afterward, as the weather closed in and the options ran out. That is the quiet, disturbing heart of this place. It does not mostly kill the reckless. It kills the competent and the confident, the people who had good reasons and good equipment and a plan, because the trap is built precisely to take a reasonable decision and convert it into a fatal one by changing the terms after the choice is already made. And people are still there, right now, tonight. The traffic never stopped. Ships still round the Cape because the coast still gives them no other way. Fishing boats still work the edge of the Gulf Stream where it crowds the shore. Tall ships and yachts and freighters still pass the point. And the pleasure boats of summer still cross water that in 1942 was carpeted with oil and bodies. The currents still collide off the tip of Diamond Shoals and still drop their load of sand, so the shoals are, at this exact moment, being rebuilt, shifting a little further from wherever the last chart put them. The fog still forms on the boundary, and the barrier island is still migrating landward under the endless push of the sea, which is why they had to pick up the tallest brick lighthouse in the country and walk it 2,900 feet inland in 1999, and why, even now, the ocean is patiently working its way back toward the new spot they moved it to, closing the distance again, the way it always closes the distance. There is one last turn, and it belongs to our own time. The sea that has been eating this coast for as long as there have been records is now rising and warming, and the barrier islands are answering the way they always have, only faster, migrating landward, thinning, breaching in the storms. This is the mechanism we have been tracing the whole way, running in fast forward. The erosion that forced the lighthouse inland in 1999 did not stop when the tower reached its new footing. It is still coming, and the ground they moved it to buys decades, not centuries. Higher water means storm surge reaches farther, and waves break closer to the dunes. A warmer ocean is the fuel a hurricane burns, and the water off Hatteras, where the Gulf Stream runs in close, is exactly the warm the storms feed on. None of this makes the shoals suddenly safe, or deadly in some tidy new way, and it would be dishonest to claim it does. The honest thing to say is that the system in this story is not a fixed exhibit behind glass. The currents still collide, but the coastline they are gnawing is on the move. The storms that arm the trap are drawing on a hotter sea, and the one seemingly permanent thing on the cape, the Great Striped Tower, is once again a structure with a countdown running quietly against it. That lighthouse is where I want to leave you. It stands today on its new ground, painted in its black and white spiral, its light still turning through the dark over the cape. Below it, out past the beach, the two currents are meeting in the black water the way they have met for longer than there have been ships to wreck, dropping their sand, stacking their steep seas, breathing the shoals a little further out to sea. The beam sweeps across that water once every few seconds. The same warning to whoever is out there. And somewhere on the lane, the geography has always squeezed. There are running lights moving down toward the point, a crew with better charts and better engines, and a better forecast than anyone in this story ever had, passing the exact spot on their own terms. Sure, they will be the ones who make it through. Most of them will. The light turns. The currents meet in the dark below it, and the sand keeps moving.